What is political conflict, and why do people take the chance? Why do people take the risk of fighting? In this part of the class, I want to spend a little bit of a time. We'll be going over in more detail in the workshop the specific readings for this week that relate to the causes of conflict. But what I want to do today is to touch on some of the main questions that we have about conflict and look at some of the initial trends about what conflict is, where have we seen it, and how does it ebb and flow over time. The two main fundamental questions that we have about political conflict is why do states and non-state actors like rebel groups, terrorist groups use violence, aggregate group level explanations, and why do individuals themselves choose to use violence. Um, Note the two different levels of these two questions, right? One is at the state aggregate level. Each one of those countries on our map is one color. Each one of those countries is represented by one government, right? Or individuals. Why do individuals decide to join a rebel group or join the government police forces or the military, right? Why do people choose to get involved and take that risk, right? Different levels of analyses, like the state level and the individual, can lead you to different conclusions, as well as different questions, right? So you need to define about who the actors are, and what level of analysis you're actually looking at. And looking at these different levels, you can actually reach different conclusions depending on which level you choose. This is an example of Simpson's paradox. I have put a link in the lecture notes to a brief description of it, which basically, the point of the paradox is that you can reach two opposite, with the same data set, you could reach two opposite conclusions depending on how you aggregate those data or don't. I think conflict is at the heart of both of the readings that we're looking at in the class. It's underlying a lot of the literature and topics we're going to be looking at over the course of the semester. And so I think it's really interesting to introduce you to some of these data sets and explanations. Some of you might have already taken peace and conflict or other classes and covered some of this, but for those of you who haven't, here are just some initial trends. Conflict is sadly something that hasn't gone away. The data here are from the Uppsala Conflict Data Project, UCDP. We're going to be seeing their data frequently over the course of the semester. A lot of the sources that we will read use them, and what you see is an ebb and flow of different forms of conflict over time. The gray, which are basically colonial wars, died out after 1975, while interstate wars, there have been more infrequent than civil wars and internationalized civil wars, but they do occur with some frequency. And you see civil wars or intrastate wars peaked right around the end of the Cold War, and then after the Arab Spring in 2011, you see a spike after that. And I think it's interesting to contrast that this map that goes up through 2019 with the map that we had for one of the readings for this week, right? You look at the map in the readings, it looks, oh great, there was some violence in the 90s, but overall it's going down over time, right? Steven Pinker has an entire book about the decline of various different forms of violence, and a lot of people have talked about the death of violence and how people have become more peaceful over time. And according to a lot of different metrics, they have, but it depends on what time frame you're actually looking at. And so it's important when you're looking at I've tried to keep most of the sources recent, some of the older sources, that if you look at the same data at different time periods, you might reach different conclusions. There's two main different types of intensity of conflict that we'll look at for civil conflicts, low level conflicts that have at least 25 battle deaths per year, and those that have caused over 1,000. The lower level conflicts are definitely the most common. You can have more than one conflict within a country. In the UCDP data, the most that any country had conflicts in a particular year is 6. Both India and Myanmar for some time period had 6 ongoing conflicts in different parts of their country. So smaller conflicts are more common, but they might get less attention than those high-level conflicts like in Syria. Look at it by region. I think the takeaway for me from looking at this graph, kind of like looking at the different maps that we had seen already, is that conflict is quite dispersed over different regions. That while sub-Saharan Africa that I was looking at in my papers is one area that gets a lot of attention, but Asia is right there as well for instances of conflict. So we're going to try over the course of the semester to include a number of different examples from different regions, not just one. And in your research papers, if you have an interest in a particular region, I'm sure if you look closely enough, you'll see a conflict that would meet this definition if you wanted to look at one in more detail. Plotting these kind of data onto those kind of blank maps that we had talked about earlier, you see the dispersion of violence in 2019 that go from Mexico from one end all the way to PNG on the other, but that you have a number of conflicts that are disproportionately represented: Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, and others, a few others. And I think in this class we're going to focus a lot on civil war and intrastate war, and that literature has grown quite dramatically since the end of the Cold War. Interstate war was more common in the study of conflict before the end of the Cold War, and I think it's really interesting that most of the literature has been focused on climate change and civil conflict, but there's been less on interstate war, which a couple of decades ago was the most common form of the study of conflict, but now civil war has taken over, and I think there's a lot of opportunities to look at resources and security and interstate conflicts, both at a lower level and potential for a higher level. This is a tweet from Colin Hendricks, UCSD, University of California, San Diego, PhD, now a professor at University of Denver. He is published widely on the climate change and conflict nexus. We're going to be seeing him repeatedly. This is a screenshot from one of the readings for today, the Barnett and Adger, just thinking about the intersection of some of these topics we've covered on and the ways that people have linked them. I think they break it up in a couple of different ways that are similar to what we're going to be looking at in the class. The links between human security, conflict, and climate change, vulnerable livelihoods, poverty, weak states, and migration. We're going to be going into each one of these in more detail, but these are some of the most common explanations for what might drive conflict from a structural or kind of background foundation. So you can see similarities between this article and hopefully in Blattman and McGill, though they're focused on two different areas of conflict research. So I think these are the challenges that we face in looking at different articles. They all have different kind of different focuses, but they all kind of fit together to try to reconcile some of these dilemmas that we faced with when looking at conflict. How do we, when looking at the Barnett and Adger list, Bladman and Miguel include a number of other explanations as well. One of the dilemmas that we're going to face over the course of the semester is how do we reconcile the different importance for these different causes. We're going to be talking about lots of different causes of conflict. Which ones are drivers of some specific conflicts versus broader conflict trends? How do we reconcile different types of or definitions of conflict? Are we really talking about the same underlying phenomenon or something different? There's a debate in the literature about terrorism and civil conflict. Terrorism is a tool of war, and so a civil conflict, scholars often include a lot of different events that are perpetrated by groups that terrorism researchers focus on exclusively. So how do we deal with different typologies of actors and conflict, different interpretations of different variables? With the Blattman and Miguel piece, they talk about it. Colin Hendricks has a piece on state capacity, different conceptualizations and interpretations of one basic relationship between GDP and conflict. And these are a lot of the different challenges we face as scholars, right? How do we figure out what we know, what people are saying, and whether they apply to what we're actually specifically looking at? And I think in trying to put it all together into one kind of more complicated path diagram than the one that I drew earlier, things can get quite complicated quite quickly. This is a screenshot of a path diagram from an influential book by Thomas Homer Dixon in 1999, looking at environment, scarcity, and violence. A lot of it overlaps with what we're going to be looking at in this class. I would encourage you to take a look at it and read it. I wanted to focus on more updated literature than this, but it still has been incredibly influential in this research, and it connects the sources of scarcity, a lot of these issues of population and production and types of conflict. We're going to be drawing our own mental maps of these relationships. You can draw your own path diagrams of it, but what we want to do is to try to take each one of these pieces and look at them in detail before trying to draw back at the end of the semester to try to reach generalizable conclusions and apply it to your own research as well.